Students, we are going to talk about dairy and cooking in terms that you will want to know and some tips and tricks for making sure cooking with dairy goes well for you. First things first, what temperature is best for dairy cooking? The answer to that would be medium heat. We want to stick with medium heat and anything that's lower because those are nice, slow, gentle ways of cooking the dairy. Anytime we start going above medium heat, we start to risk the quality of our product. And you'll see in the next couple slides what exactly can happen if we are not using proper heat when cooking with our dairy. Curds and whey is used to describe when milk thickens and separates into solid clusters and liquids, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing. What we need to consider is that when cows on the farm are milked and that raw milk is taken to places where it's going to be produced, there are times when they're going to purposefully separate out the curds and the whey because the solid clusters, those curds, that's what they're going to use to start making cheese. Whereas the liquid part, the whey, they'll start to use that for making other dairy products that we see on store shelves. So there are times and places when curds and whey is perfectly acceptable, and we want to see that separation take place. Scalding is a term used that means heating milk just below the boiling point. So this is when we do not have bubbles coming up to the surface and breaking. Now, if you're looking at the picture, some of you are like, yeah, right, Danielson, I see bubbles. Okay, and I'm pretty sure you're referring to the bubbles right around the edge of the pan. Okay, well, let's think about it. How many of you have ever poured a glass of milk and you notice that there's bubbles around the edge of your glass? And you haven't heated your milk though. Yeah, because when you pour milk into a glass or a bowl or a pan, there are some air bubbles that get incorporated just from the simple act of pouring. So the bubbles that we're seeing, those are not from heating. That's just from simply pouring the milk into the pan. Now, for scalding, some things that you would notice then, because the question is, well, how do I know it's scalded? Well, if you had a food thermometer, you could take the temperature, but let's be real. We've already established back in our food storage learning days, not many of us have a food thermometer sitting around that we can use. So we have to go with visual cues to let us know, okay, it's scalded. So things that we would notice is that there is steam rising up off the surface. It's not going to be like tons and tons of steam, but it's definitely going to be noticeable, and we're thinking, okay, this is definitely warming up. Okay. Another thing you're going to notice is that there's a very thin film that forms on the top of the milk. And it's almost like if I took my wooden spoon or my rubber scraper and if I just drag it across the milk, it's almost like it looks wrinkly on the top. And that would be that very thin film or skin. And oftentimes too, when you're stirring the milk, some of you can actually notice a little bit of a difference in texture. For some people, they say it's not wanting to splash up and out of the pan as easily as what it wanted to when you first poured the milk in. So there's some different things that you could look for to know, yes, it is indeed scalded. Tempering is a process we use to bring the temperature of one food up to the temperature of another. And this is going to help us prevent curdling our product. Now, if we were in class together, we would have had the opportunity to make homemade pudding. And tempering is a technique that we would use because, like you can see in the picture, what happens is we heat our milk up, and then down in the bowl we would have raw eggs whisked. Okay, well, if I pour hot milk all into this bowl and I'm not doing any tempering, I just dump the milk in, my eggs are actually going to cook themselves. And when I go to eat my pudding, I'm going to notice I have little scrambled egg chunks in my pudding. Some of you would be like, that doesn't bother me. I like scrambled eggs. But the point is, when you think of pudding, there shouldn't be these scrambled egg chunkies in there. So clearly, we did something wrong. So the idea of tempering is I'm whisking my eggs very vigorously, whisking, 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 while slowly pouring the hot milk mixture into the eggs. Because then it's slowly bringing the temperature of the eggs up to the temperature of this hotter milk from the pan. Because if we don't do that, we will have curdling occur. Now, obviously, in the tempering picture, we would have noticed it with the eggs. The eggs would have cooked themselves, but let's say there's no eggs present. Okay, well, dairy can still curdle itself on its own. So, curdling is when you cook milk at too high of a temperature, causing a separation of the solids and the liquids. Now, notice the difference between this and when we were actually talking about curds and whey. Okay, curds and whey is totally acceptable. Curdling, ooh, that's like the point of no return. And this is actually supposed to be an Alfredo sauce, which for those of you that know Alfredo, you know right now this is not okay. And some people would argue, oh, it's fine, we can fix it. We're just gonna stick it in a blender and it's gonna blend out and be smooth. Well, it's going to be smoother, but it's not going to be creamy smooth. It's going to be gritty smooth. You're not going to get rid of that grittiness that's there from the curdling. So oftentimes then what you're going to have to do is you have to make your sauces from scratch. You have to start over again. Because once you get to this point, like I said, it's like the point of no return. Once it's curdled, it's curdled. Now, scorching is another term where, oopsie daisy, we have definitely done a little too much cooking here. So, scorching happens when the milk solids or the lactose settle to the sides and or the bottom of the pan and burn. Now, lactose is the term we use to define milk sugars. So whenever you hear the word lactose, think milk sugars. And yeah, if you were to overcook sugar or you burn sugar, it is going to get that caramely, darker appearance to it. So that's what's happening is these solids, this milk sugar stuff is settling to the bottom, and when it just sits there like that, yeah, of course it's going to burn. So is it going to hurt things to the point you can't use what you're making? Not necessarily. But it could. So we just want to make sure we can do whatever we can to prevent the scorching. And oftentimes, what that means is stick with your medium heat or lower and keep your mixtures moving. Because if the milk solids have a chance to settle, well, then that's giving them the chance to burn. But if you keep your mixtures moving by just stirring it, dragging your rubber scraper through, then those milk solids don't have as much opportunity to settle and burn. So those are some things you could do to prevent it. Now, on the flip side, how in the world are you going to clean that? Because, yeah, you got to clean that out. So, a lot of times, what you can do is let your pan soak, come back with a scrub sponge, and get that stuff to lift up. Another thing would be it would be hopeful if you used a non-stick pan to begin with. That would make your life a little bit easier too. Not to say it's going to be the easiest thing to still clean out, but it is a little bit easier. If you were to compare to say like a stainless steel pan that doesn't have any non-stick coating in it. So there are cleaners that are made specifically for different types of pots and pans. So if something were to burn, or in this case, scorch, it will help remove it out. So just keep an eye out for those cleaners. This would be a great opportunity. Again, look at your owner's manuals when you first buy your sets of pots and pans, or do a basic Google search, because there will be a lot of ideas that come up that you could potentially use to get your cookware clean again. All right, so what happens to cheese if it's cooked at too high of a temperature for too long? Well, for those of you that have ever tried to do nachos in the microwave, you know it gets tough and rubbery, and you go to pick up one chip, and 10 chips are like stuck to the cheese and come along with it. So, is it a bad thing? No, because I know many of you that you're still going to eat those nachos and you're not going to care. You like it, and that's fine. But we do want to be mindful of, if we're serving this to other people, what is their perception? Because if I were to go to a restaurant and my nachos are like that, I'm not going to be too impressed, because when I think of nachos at a restaurant, I want silky, creamy cheese that I can dip my chips in, and the whole plate of chips doesn't lift up with tough, rubbery cheese. Okay. All right, other terms to know. A roux. This is roux, not raux. It's roux. The X is silent on the end. It's a French word. It's roux. So a roux is equal parts of fat and flour. And the purpose of a roux is to thicken our dishes. Now, it's interesting and quite a coincidence that we have Thanksgiving coming up because some of you, if you were to make something like gravy, I'm going to bet you've got family members that are making a roux to thicken up your gravy, which you're putting your learning to use then. So if it's equal parts of fat and flour, let's say I was to use 2 tablespoons of fat. Well, then I'm going to use 2 tablespoons of flour. Let's say I use a half cup of fat. Well, then I'm going to use a half cup of flour. Well, let's say I use 1 cup of fat. Okay, well then I'm using 1 cup of flour. So it's equal parts. And the cool thing is I can use this roux to thicken up lots of things like sauces, gravies, soups. I definitely have some options. Now, on the flip side, I'm going to take a guess that if your families don't use a roux, you might use some kind of a cornstarch slurry. Oftentimes, what happens is you might just add some cornstarch into your sauce, soup, or gravy, or you might take a mixture of cornstarch that's mixed with a little bit of water. That's what they call a slurry, then. But that can thicken up whatever it is that needs thickening as well. So you've got some options. But since we're talking about dairy, a roux would be one of them. And then the idea is if I was starting with my roux and if I was going to turn it into a sauce, a soup, a gravy, whatever it is, I usually start adding liquids to it. And if I was making a white sauce, I'm adding milk to it. And I add just little bits at a time, let the roux soak it up, making sure I mix until all the lumpy bumpies are gone before I start adding in more parts of the milk. And then eventually, if I've done it right, I should have something that's looking silky, smooth, creamy, no lumps and bumps, and end products would definitely, we would like to have something that looks like this, very silky, smooth, creamy in texture. So we will talk more about this roux and this whole idea of white sauce in the future, but for today you've got your cooking terms and we'll move on to the next item on our agenda.